Hi, everybody. Welcome to Grimwit with Dimwits. I'm T.
And I'm Blondie.
Today's episode is going to take place in Austin, Texas, way back in the 1800s. And we did want to let everybody know that some of the crime scene descriptions are a little bit graphic. So if you're sensitive to this type of thing, here is your heads up.
Well, as T said, this is taking place in 1884 and 1885 in Austin, Texas. Many books, articles, and podcasts have already been done about this, but I went on the Murder Walk Austin tour last year, got a firsthand view of the streets and what it could have possibly been like at that time. The tour was about Servant Girl murders, also known as Servant Girl Annihilator. Now, William Sidney Porter, better known as writer O. Henry, was living in Austin at the time of the murders. Porter had coined the term Servant Girl Annihilators on May 15, 1885, in a letter addressed to Dave Hall. He said, quote, "The town is fearfully dull except for the frequent raids of the Servant Girl Annihilators, who make things lively in the dull hours of the night." It was interesting that he referred to the killer as plural, annihilators.
Well, and what's also interesting to me is that if I heard you right, it sounds like this is their only form of entertainment.
Well, that was his. He was living there at the time, and because they're moving on and building the city. So yeah, it was dull.
People were so different back then when they thought that killings and death, and if we go way back, public executions were some type of even family entertainment. It's so bizarre to me.
It really was. You have this huge crowd to just sit there and watch somebody be hung.
Then you have a picnic while they're doing it. Insane.
So a serial killer terrorized Austin. Originally, the term they used in 1885 was lust murders. It wasn't until 75 years later the term serial killer actually came about.
Lust murders just sound so sexual, so I'm going to assume there's some kind of sexual component to this.
It did. I looked it up, and lust murders did refer to sexual type of murders.
Okay, makes sense.
So in 1884, Austin was on the rise, new construction, new communities. They were building the Capitol, had plots of land for new homes. It was on its way to becoming a big city. As a matter of fact, in 1840, there was approximately 550 citizens. And by 1900, it was up to 22,000.
Wow, that's a big change.
That's a big change. With the rise of the city and citizens, crime and violence was also on the rise. By mid-1884, home invasions and servant girl assaults were predominant.
Wow, that's really sad, taking advantage of people who probably don't have much and were not really well taken care of.
And they didn't have security or anything at that time either, right?
Right. And I don't think they'd be anybody's first priority back in those days.
They were not.
Really sad.
In July, there were 2 separate cases of women being stabbed viciously across the face while sleeping. Then in August, a woman was beaten with a smoothing iron while she slept.
What's a smoothing iron?
Just going to say, I looked up a smoothing iron, and basically what it was a flat iron or just an iron that had the metal plate that had a handle. They would heat it hot enough to smooth clothes. They put a cloth over it so when they went across the garments, they wouldn't get soot and everything on the clothes.
Oh, I wish you all could see Blondie's hand motions describing this to me. I know exactly what it is through her hands. She didn't even have to say a word.
I do talk with my hands. I think I have a little Italian in me. But honestly, though, can you imagine being hit by that?
No, they had to be heavy back then.
The whole thing was metal.
That's crazy.
If you think about it, things haven't changed since 1884, as it appears to be a pattern forming with criminals escalating towards something more gruesome. They started with basic crimes, so you just know it's escalating and escalating, especially with all the new citizens.
Wow. Isn't that sad? Because it's still kind of like that these days. You can go from a smaller town where, for whatever reason, you feel a little bit safer. And then as soon as you get into the big city, you got to start looking over your shoulder and watching your back.
Exactly.
It shouldn't be that way.
So case in point to this, Molly Smith, 25 years old, a cook who lived with her boyfriend husband. I heard both ways. Walter Spencer, 30. Molly also had a 10-year-old son, although it appeared he didn't live with them. On December 30th, 1884, Molly and Walter were sleeping when Walter woke up screaming in pain. His head had a deep gash that was bleeding profusely. He looked around the room to see that Molly was gone. There were signs of struggle, and copious amounts of blood filled the room. Then he noticed a trail of blood that led outside. At the end of the trail lay Molly in the snow by the outhouse. She had an axe wound to her head that broke her skull, cuts and scratches to her chest, abdomen, legs, and arms. She had also been raped.
Oh, geez. That's pretty horrifying.
Talk about escalating.
Yeah.
She was the first. Eliza Shelley, 30, also a cook employed by Dr. Johnson. Eliza and her 3 small children lived in a one-room cabin on Dr. Johnson's property. On May 7th, Dr. Johnson returned from the market like he did every morning. When he arrived, there was a commotion at the house. His wife told him, "I believe Eliza has been murdered." The doctor walked into her room to find a horrific scene. Eliza was stretched on the floor with a gaping wound over her right eye, about 2 inches long and just as wide, that went through her skull to her brain, almost completely splitting her head from the blows and causing instant death.
When you say 2 inches long and 2 inches wide, that's crazy.
That's huge.
And it went through her skull. That would require so much force.
Yes. For it to almost completely split her head in half, yes, it did.
That is wild.
They assumed this was done with a hatchet. There was also a deep, round hole stabbed just above her ear and another right between her eyes, along with several minor wounds. Underneath her was blood-soaked sheets suggesting the attack happened while she slept. The killer pulled her off the bed and onto the floor.
Jeez. It seems so personal when you hit someone like right between the eyes, and I don't know. I can't imagine looking at somebody's face and wanting to do that type of damage. It's just so sadistic.
It's a frame of mind of someone.
You really have to be insane to be like that.
There was a story that was told about her 8-year-old son that he saw the killer. He couldn't remember any details other than he had a rag over his face. Her son stated, "A man came in the room and asked me where my mother kept her money. Her son said, I told him I didn't know. He told me to cover my head. If I didn't, he would kill me." One thing I saw, the boy had said that the man told him he was leaving for New Orleans in the morning. Her son fell back asleep till the morning.
You know, I hate to give any type of credit to a crazed killer, but thank God he didn't hurt the boy.
Yeah, any of the children. She had 3 kids.
Yeah, that's next level, but thank God he didn't hurt the kids.
Exactly. One of the suspects of Eliza's murder was Ike Plummer, a former lover. He was charged for her murder and had a hearing to determine if there was sufficient evidence. Witness accounts stated that Plummer had been seen talking to Eliza the day before at her house, asking her for money. She told him, "I have none for you. What little I have is for my children, and I don't want you around me." He walked away, and it was noted that he had a hatchet in his pocket. If all this was true, the case is circumstantial, and he wasn't tried. Plummer strongly denied guilt.
Wouldn't you think that even with the rag over his face, the kid might recognize Plummer's voice if he had been around for any amount of time?
Oh, possibly. I didn't think about that.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you don't even need to see a person's face to be familiar with who they are. So I don't know. It just seems kind of like a long shot to me.
Well, like I said, it was circumstantial. It was just somebody heard this and somebody saw that. It wasn't any proof that they actually witnessed him doing anything.
Right.
So on May 23rd, 1885, a servant named Irene Cross, who was 33, was asleep in her bed with her door unlocked for her son, who would come home late. Irene was awoken by an assailant. She cried out. He slashed her arm, cutting a 6-inch gash, cutting an artery with a long, sharp knife, possibly a razor. I always have visions of those razors. The assailant then proceeded to cut across her head, just above her right eye. It was said that it looked like she had been scalped.
When you say he cut across her head, I'm having visions of somebody scalping somebody, like very purposefully doing that particular cut.
In reading everything and looking at the timelines, I am curious why it was 5 months from the second and third from the first attack. The first one was December 31st, and the next one isn't until May. My theory on that is that he was kind of just hanging out waiting to see if anybody caught him or if they came after him.
Maybe just hiding out But as soon as you said the dates, I thought, and I know Austin isn't a very cold area, but I don't know what the winters are like out there. Maybe he went somewhere else for the winter because December to May would be the coldest time of the year. But again, I don't know. Might be in the 70s during their winters. I have no idea.
But then when he came back in May, it was definitely with a vengeance.
Yeah, so who knows? That's a good question.
Yeah. From KVUE ABC article on November 17th, 2014, it was reported that before she died from her injuries, Irene's son told the police that an intruder was a big, chunky man, barefooted with his pants rolled up, wearing a brown hat and a raggedy coat, and carrying a pocket knife.
Wow, he got a really good look at him.
This is what Irene told her son. After she passed away, he related to the police.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
Okay. In an article from Austin Weekly Statesman, May 28, 1885, a citizen said, a public meeting ought to be called, vigilance committees should be formed, and orders to leave the city instanter should be given to every loafer and vagabond. Now, I did look up instanter. Instanter means at once.
Okay, I was wondering.
The three that have already happened are extremely sad and awful, what was done to them, but this next one actually kind of just really broke my heart. Mary Ramey was just 11 years old.
Oh.
On August 30th, 1885, Mary and her mother, Rebecca, were asleep when Rebecca was hit with a blow so hard it knocked her unconscious. Her daughter Mary was dragged into the backyard, stabbed with an iron rod through her ear, and raped.
Wait a minute. The same iron rod that they used to press things with?
It was just an iron rod.
Oh, okay. Because I was going to say that would have to have a really dull end, and that would be hard to do. My brain went crazy with that one.
I just envisioned this poor little girl and this thing going through her head.
Yeah, me too.
A bloody, unusually shaped footprint was found in the soil. You need to remember that little detail for later.
Okay.
Mary initially survived the attack, but died a few hours later from her wounds. Her mother did survive.
Wow.
Yeah.
How sad. You know, as a parent, you go through something like that with your child. I don't even know if I'd want to survive. That would just be too traumatic.
I think the part that bothered me is poor little girl was alive for a few hours, just wondering what happened. I don't know how, with a rod through your head, how much you can actually process. But
she had that will to survive a little bit longer. Oh, that just breaks my heart.
Breaks my heart.
Yeah.
So the terror continues. Gracie Vance, 20, and her husband Orange Washington, 25, Lucinda Body, and Patsy Gibson, both 17, lived in a cabin on Guadalupe Street. Gracie worked as a servant while her husband, Orange, worked as a cook. On September 25th, 1885, a killer entered. He saw the three women and one man sleeping. Apparently, it didn't scare him away. He incapacitated the four of them as quickly as possible. Orange was hit with an axe blow to his head, obliterating his skull, leaving him motionless. Lucinda and Patsy were also struck with an axe, knocking them unconscious. Gracie was struck in the head with the axe, enabling the killer to drag her outside to the property stables. She was raped and bludgeoned to death with a brick. According to the Austin Daily Statesman, her head was almost beaten into jelly.
Oh my God. That is disturbing.
One of the women, I wasn't sure if it was Lucinda or Patsy, had woke up and escaped and went for help. The neighbors heard the disturbance and called the police. They went to investigate and saw a man running. They fired their guns, but he escaped.
I'm curious. It sounds like, except for one, I think the last one too, if I remember right, they keep dragging them outside.
They drag the women outside.
But I wonder why that is, because I would think that they would be more exposed. You're dragging someone who's probably moaning or maybe even screaming and taking them outside and raping them. I would think that they would want to do that in the privacy of the home. So that's really odd.
My theory on that is that a lot of these homes were actually on the property of their employers, people they work for, attached to the kitchen, attached to the back of the house, or just a few steps away. So my thought on that is if they take them outside away from that, if anybody goes into the kitchen or is walking around the house, they're going to hear them in that room.
Mm-hmm.
So if they take them outside, they're taking them away from where people are.
On this last one, though, I mean, it sounded like he killed everybody in the house, which is why I was like, why would you drag her outside on top of that?
I don't know. It could be close to another house.
Yeah.
Or maybe he didn't think he killed them, so he took her away so he could finish what he needed to do with her.
I guess we're never going to make sense of, out of craziness.
No. At the time, Orange was still bleeding when they found him, but he didn't survive long. One of the things I had read said that Patsy will die with her brain oozing from her skull, and Lucinda will probably die. They both survived.
Oh my gosh. Okay, that's the only good part of the story I've heard so far.
Well, I'm thinking,
That's crazy.
he had these 4 people in this room. The chances of him not incapacitating one of them enough, obviously it was high.
Right.
Because he was in a hurry.
Right.
For some unknown reason, the killer has now changed his MO, as his next 2 victims were not servants or cooks.
Oh, interesting.
Yes. Susan Hancock, 41, was married to Moses Hancock and had 2 girls, Lena, 15, and Ida, 10. Susan was described as one of the most refined ladies in Austin. While Susan slept, an axe came down on her head with enough force to split it open.
Jeez.
Susan was dragged into the backyard where a thin object was stuck through her right ear, lodging in her brain.
Oh my gosh.
Susan's husband was asleep in another room, but woke up to the noises outside. He went to the backyard and saw a figure by Susan. He threw a brick at him. The figure had the axe, but he didn't come after him. He ran out of the yard, and even though Moses had tried to follow him, he disappeared. This occurred on December 24th, 1885. She survived for 3 days and died of her wounds on December 28th, 1885.
Is it just me, or does this one sound totally different? The fact that he wasn't going after the husband, that he ran off with an axe in his pocket, I don't know. It doesn't sound like the same killer moves from before.
Well, he didn't have an axe in his pocket, but...
Oh. Didn't he have an axe on him?
He did have an axe. He was inclined to use things picked up along the way, but he always stuck to things he was very familiar with.
But this particular incident seems like this guy was more scared, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
He was scared away because the husband came down. So,
but the husband just had a brick. He didn't even have a gun or anything.
But again, he's targeting women.
Yeah, that's very true.
So a man comes up completely not what he's looking for.
Because he's a coward when it comes to a man.
Right.
Which is disgusting.
So he ran.
Wow.
He's like, no, I'm not going to deal with it. And she did survive for 3 days, but it made me wonder, what exactly was he going to do? Did he finish what he intended to do? Because he was just standing over her at the time.
Well, she passed away, so thankfully she didn't have to endure anything else he had to offer.
Right.
Or what he was trying to do.
It's so sad.
No, it's really sad.
About an hour after Susan Hancock was murdered on December 24th, 1885, the last victim, Eula Phillips, was attacked. She was known as one of the most beautiful women in Austin. I've seen pictures. She was beautiful.
Wow.
Eula was 17 and married to James Phillips Jr., also known as Jimmy. They had a 1-year-old son named Thomas. They lived with Jimmy's parents.
Oh, she was a child bride.
She was. I forget what they called it. There was a word that I saw that when you are pregnant, it's a type of marriage. There's actually like a word to describe
this. Like a shotgun wedding?
Yeah, it's not shotgun, but there was another. A marriage out of necessity.
Oh, there we go.
There we go.
We should have kept that name because shotgun wedding just sounds so aggressive.
On Christmas Eve, while the family slept, someone entered their home and attacked them with an axe. Jimmy was knocked almost unconscious with a swing of the axe to his head, causing a huge gaping gash. Eula was struck by bashing her skull, spewing blood. She was dragged, leaving a trail of blood, to an unlit alley behind her father-in-law's house. Large pieces of wood had been laid across her arms and chest to hold her down during the attack.
Oh my gosh.
When she was found, she was nude, raped, and murdered. A journalist from the Fort Worth Gazette went to the scene and said, quote, Eula was on her back, her face turned upward in the dim moonlight with an expression of agony that death itself had not erased from her features.
Oh my goodness. That definitely tells the story.
So, I mean, after all of this, I guess the question with everybody, us included, is it multiple murders? Is it murderers? Is it one murderer, one killer?
Well, I still think murder prior to Eula's, Susan, I believe her name was a little different. I think that one was a little different. Because even in this one with Eula, he went straight in. So there was
he went and attacked. Well, okay, so let me back to that. Susan and her husband were not sleeping in the same room.
Okay.
When he attacks the men, they're asleep. They're laying down. They're not prone to attack.
Right.
Where her husband,
They're helpless.
Her husband came out and was standing there and was like ready. He threw the brick at him.
As long as you're asleep, and man or woman, he's brave enough to hit that. But, as soon as you stand up with a brick in your hand, which really, unless you throw it with such force, it's not going to do a lot of damage. Then he runs off like a coward.
He does.
It's just sad.
There were several theories based on multiple suspects. They were brought into authorities, about 400 to be exact. Some were charged, however, they were all released.
All 400?
All 400.
Wow, and that's a lot of people to bring in.
That's a lot of people.
Especially back then. Their processing, I imagine, took a little bit of time with a smaller amount of officers, I'm going to guess.
Well, if you would have waited just 2 seconds.
Sorry, I'm visualizing here.
There were instances where law enforcement did not link the murders together. I think the one was the Susan and Eula. That was the main one they didn't link together. From an interview HDSI did with a former police officer, Doug Dukes, Dukes stated, quote, that in 1885, the 12-man police force had plenty of violent crimes to deal with, but little experience with detective investigation or modern police work, end quote. I think that's the theory of bringing all these men in, if it's just one little snippet. And they were all circumstantial, obviously,
right,
that they released them. The police were tight-lipped about certain details of the murderer. The main was the bloody, bare, disfigured footprint of the predator from Mary's crime scene. When I said, remember that?
Mm-hmm.
It was assumed that he didn't wear his boots, so he could be stealthy going in and coming out.
That makes sense.
The hope was that the right foot with 4 toes only could be used as a suspect identifier.
Wow.
One of the specific theories was based on a man, Maurice. He was a Malaysian cook who worked at the Pearl House Hotel in Austin. It was said that Maurice had told his friends that he was planning to go to London, and he was gone by January 1886. Now, the last murder was Christmas Eve.
Okay.
A strong presumption that Maurice was the murderer of the Austin women was created by the fact that all of them except 2 or 3 resided in the immediate neighborhood of the Pearl House. Now, this is what the Austin American Statesman reported in November 1888.
Okay.
I remember the story of Maurice as part of the tour. The guide was telling the story when we were going down the street. He said this is where the Pearl House was located, and he was very vividly describing of possibly what Maurice could look like, him standing in the street holding an axe. It was just amazing the way he described it and how you could actually visualize it. Even the Pearl House wasn't there anymore, but you could actually visualize what the murderer would possibly look like.
Sounds like that was a really great tour, and if anyone's interested in this story, finding out more, that'd be the way to go.
It was an amazing tour. It was, I think, 2 hours, but very informative. Another specific story, which is to be considered more likely, was a man named Nathan Elgin. Nathan lived near some of the crime scenes and had several run-ins with law enforcement. Such as, in 1881, Elgin was arrested for carrying a pistol and having an altercation with another man. They caused such a ruckus with cussing and arguing. I thought that was funny. They caused such a ruckus.
How dare they?
Right. In 1882, Elgin sent a threatening letter to a deputy sheriff stating he would whip, destroy, and kill him next time he saw him.
Jeez, that's ballsy.
He's very aggressive. In some research, there was great detail about making of a serial killer in ServantGirlMurders.com, focusing on the parents of the assailants and if they had been abused themselves emotionally, sexually, or physically, which in turn they would abuse their children.
A vicious cycle that happens to way too many people. There's probably a lot of things that contribute to that, but I do think it's just a learned behavior, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. And even though there's so many children that swear they won't be like their parents, that's exactly who they end up being like.
Exactly.
They're products of their environment.
Mm-hmm. In this article, they specifically talked about Nathan Elgin, his childhood, and his relationship with his mother and stepmother. They had mentioned his mother was Angeline, but wasn't sure what happened to her. And he was raised by his stepmother. Now, at a young age, was 14, he was put to work as a servant. The abuse, humiliation of having to work as a servant at a very young age and do whatever was asked of him by the women he worked for could have been the catalyst.
Oh, kind of like that's why he hated women.
It was said The killer is seen to be explosive, impulsive, and quick to temper, with fantasies of being the aggressor and repeating the abuse. They generally wouldn't know their victims or who they were, but they were familiar with the areas that they were killing in. One night in February 1886, there was a disturbing and violent scene that took place in an Austin saloon. A drunk and raging man pulled a woman named Julia from the saloon to a nearby house. Julia was screaming for help while the man was beating and yelling at her.
Jeez.
With all the commotion in the neighborhood, a nearby police officer, John Bracken, along with a neighbor and the saloon keeper, headed to stop the man before he killed her. They went into the house, pulled the man out into the front yard while Bracken tried to arrest him. The man fought off the three men and pulled a knife. Getting to his feet, Bracken stood and shot the angry man. The man's name was Nathan Elgin.
Oh, wow.
There was no reason given why he was attacking Julia, but Elgin did not die that night. However, the bullet left him paralyzed, and he did die the next day. An autopsy was performed, which revealed that the shot lodged in his spine, which paralyzed him. They also noted that his right foot was missing a toe.
Ooh.
Right?
Wow. Nobody knew that prior to this?
No, he's always wearing shoes, I'm assuming. Well, and that goes back to the police didn't release that detail.
Oh, that's what they were holding on to?
They were holding on to that.
Okay, that makes sense.
Authorities now had direct physical evidence, much to their surprise, that a distinctive footprint matched the killer's. But Elgin is dead, so they can't question him.
Right.
It's only been a couple months since the last killing, so what do? The question is, was Nathan Elgin the killer? Do they tell the town that they killed the murderer? What if Elgin wasn't the killer?
Well, I mean, the fact that he could go into a saloon and drag a woman out and start beating her, he has that personality.
He did have that very explosive temper.
And he's so bold to go in and just do it in front of everybody.
But you also take consideration he was drunk as well. So that does mess with your...
He had beer muscles.
He had beer muscles. So at this point, the city was on high alert. The police force had tripled. The 24-hour saloons were forced to close at midnight, and citizens were organized to watch the town after dark. They had a new law and order enforcement. And I was thinking about the citizens patrolling at night. I was wondering if that's the first neighborhood watch. During all this, there were two remaining suspects. The first, James Phillips Jr., Eula's husband. They arrested Jimmy on January 2nd, 1886, for Eula Phillips' murder.
Okay, wait a minute. They arrested him for the 17-year-old Eula Phillips murder?
His wife, yeah.
His wife?
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't see that coming.
In February, Jimmy had a preliminary hearing where 60 witnesses testified. Based on the numerous facts, he was held in jail till May.
Wow.
Now, this is where it gets interesting. There were rumors that Eula had been a prostitute or was having affairs. She considered May Tobin a whorehouse owner and associate, which at that time, that was not okay.
Yes, it was not acceptable.
Yes. The whorehouse also rented rooms for people to go to express their
desires.
Right. The affairs Eula supposedly was having were with state government officials, which included Controller Swan, who was running for governor.
Oh, here we go.
Here we go. And she had visited May Tobin's house an hour before she was murdered.
Okay, that's more than a coincidence.
During the investigation, it had come out that Jimmy and Eula weren't happy. Eula was upset because Jimmy did not have a job and was a heavy drinker. Jimmy was also quoted as saying, "If I were to find out that Eula were cheating on me, I would kill her and myself." For him to say that, I kind of do wonder if he had some suspicions.
But he didn't kill himself. They never do. The cowards never do.
No. The trial began. Jimmy was still recovering from his injuries and was very weak. During the trial, the prosecution portrayed Eula as the unfaithful woman and Jimmy as a jealous man. So in the defense's way to sway that, they had Jimmy standing in ink carrying 170 pounds, stepping barefoot to compare the footprint of the killer. It did not match.
Oh.
Now they had him hold the 170 pounds because the footprint was very indented in the soil.
Okay.
Because he's dragging people out.
Right. I was going to say, if that's supposed to be the weight of the woman, that's a strong man.
Yeah. After several more compelling witnesses, Jimmy was found guilty of second-degree murder and convicted for 7 years.
So wait a minute. They convicted him of killing his wife?
They did.
Oh.
However,
okay.
6 months later, the conviction was overturned by the Court of Appeals.
Okay. Boy, this is all over the place.
All over the place. So a side note, I saw this and I thought this was very interesting. The Court of Appeals' reasoning was, I quote, first, the court erred in permitting the state to prove the unchastity of the defendant's wife as a motive for the killing, without having shown that this unchastity was brought to the defendant's knowledge. Second, the court erred in permitting the state to prove conditional and insignificant threats made by the defendant, which under the circumstances when they were made showed no intention of the defendant carrying them out.
That's fair.
So that was the reason why they let him go.
I can see their point in both of those things.
It was all circumstantial, basically.
Yes, it really was. And it's kind of surprising to hear that he was arrested for that.
And bearing in mind, he was also hit with the axe as well. Yes. He was just knocked completely out.
I completely forgot about that part. So yeah, add that in, and yeah, I don't even know how they convicted him.
They actually said that he could have done it to himself.
But who would?
I mean, that's trying to sway the guilty, I guess.
That's crazy.
After he was released, the second person that was arrested was Moses Hancock for the murder of his wife, Susan Hancock. The charges were dropped and he was released. However, with the efforts of his brother-in-law, William Skaggs, and private detectives who had done some investigating, they had presented more evidence showing Moses's guilt. So Moses was rearrested and charged with the murder of his wife. At a preliminary hearing in June 1886, Martha Falwell, Susan Hancock's sister, had stated that Moses was a drunk and he was abusive to Susan. Also, Lena, Moses and Susan's daughter, said their mother wrote a letter to Moses saying she was leaving because she was afraid of being murdered.
Oh, wow.
Susan never gave Moses this letter. She had hidden it away, and they found it among her belongings after her death.
That's interesting.
That's interesting.
Yeah, because I assume that when you were saying about the letter that he knew about it. But now that he doesn't know about it.
He doesn't know about it.
That really leaves everything up open for question.
On May 30th, 1887, the trial begins. The prosecution tries to show that Moses was the only one at the house that could have done the killing. Some testimony was given, one from their neighbor, that stated Susan had asked the neighbor to take Moses to town because he was drunk and she was afraid of him, but Moses refused to go. At that point, the defense tries to show that Moses was sober and other people were in the house. But one of the gentlemen had testified he smelled alcohol on Moses' breath that same day. Ultimately, 3 jurors voted for murder, 8 for acquittal, and 1 was doubtful. The case was dismissed.
Wow.
There's a lot of speculations, theories, and opinion as to the Servant Girl murders. Was it the husbands that killed them because of alcohol and infidelity? Was it Maurice because he went to London and the killing stopped? Was it Nathan Elgin, who died but had the one toe missing, and another reason why the killings had stopped? At the end of the tour, it was brought up that possibly the Annihilator and Jack the Ripper were the same person, and the person might have been Maurice, who traveled to London. The last killing was on December 24th, 1885, and nothing after, but Jack the Ripper killings started in 1888. There is an author, Shirley Harrison, also believes that the Annihilator and the Ripper are one and the same, though she names Liverpool cotton merchant James Mayback instead of the Malaysian chef Maurice. In an interesting hypothesis described by Harrison in her book Jack the Ripper, The American Connection, according to Mayback's own purported journals, which included confessions of killing prostitutes as well as a signed page stating Jack the Ripper, Mayback was in Austin on the dates the Annihilator murders occurred, another detail that could point to an English Annihilator. Now, Mayback died of arsenic and strychnine poisoning, possibly administered by his wife, in May 1889. After, both series of murders ended. Perhaps that's why.
There are so many potential suspects here, and I get why they're all suspects. I mean, that's pretty wild that even those last two murders did seem a little different from the other ones and from each other.
Right.
So it makes you wonder, did someone do the first ones? The husbands do the second ones? You know, this guy, who knows? One of those guys go over to London and become Jack the Ripper. This is a pretty wild story, and I like how everything is kind of intertwined and you're still kind of left hanging.
And you are, because they stopped. The huge theory is that it was Nathan Elgin. But then again, you're talking the same type of murders in London. Like 2 years later, Maurice took a ship to London.
They're all viable with the little bit of information that you presented here. I mean, they're all viable.
Oh, they are.
It's crazy. That is crazy.
So actually, my curiosity of the Annihilator was definitely heightened during the Murder Walk Austin tour, mainly because the guide had mentioned that it could be Jack the Ripper and the Annihilator being the same person. So here's the funny part. You know, I had attempted to go on the Jack the Ripper walking tour in London in 2017. However, I got lost on my way to the meeting point. Then T and I tried to go on the tour in 2021, but enjoyed our dinner for just a little too long, got off the wrong subway stop, and were too late for the tour. They'd already left.
And the most important part, I lost my glasses along the way. They're still there.
We were running, so I guess you could definitely call us dimwits at that point.
You know, we're true to our name.
We are.
I really wanted to go on that walking tour because I know you had missed it the first time, and it was kind of our goal on that trip.
Right.
Definitely doing. Didn't we try to do it twice? Or maybe you booked it, we couldn't get on, or you tried to book it.
I think something else was overlapping, so
so then when we finally got it, we were like, yes, and we still
missed it. But you know what? On the upside, I guess that's a reason for me to go back, or us to go back. Third time's a charm.
I need to go too, because now I'm all in.
So that is the story of the Servant Girl murders, the Servant Girl Annihilator. I just found the whole thing, albeit sad, very interesting.
It was very sad. It was very tragic. Whoever, or if there's more than one, did these murders. I mean, you talk about a sick and twisted individual, but it may and may not have been Jack the Ripper. It would be interesting if it was. I hope that someday there's some type of
proof or something.
some type of, somehow this gets resolved. And if there's a connection, I would love to know in my lifetime. But yeah, great story.
Oh, well, I'm glad you enjoyed it.
I did.
I hope everyone else enjoyed it as well.
I'm sure they did. All right, guys. Well, that's it for today. Have fun, take care, and just let your imaginations run wild.
Bye.
Bye-bye. We just want to thank you all for sharing your time with us. And if you'd like to send in your creepy little grim bits, we would love to hear your personal stories, interests, and suggestions. Please email them to grimwitwithdimwits@gmail.com. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram at grimwitwithdimwits and Facebook grimwitwithdimwits to listen for our new episodes, and feel free to share with your grim-loving friends. We would really appreciate if you would take a minute to rate and review. 5-star ratings go a long way and would really help us out. Until then, we would love it if you'd come back next week to delve with us into the strange and unusual things we just can't wrap our skulls around.